Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to have accepted the invitation of this Society of Island Biology, which I like very much. I have been in the last symposia, and I have enjoyed very much to know all this family of island biologists. And well, thanks, Josemari, for this introduction. And well, I will be presenting these the results that my team and I have been finding in this research we have been conducting in different archipelagos, as you said. And for this talk, I'm going to focus on the role of vertebrates on plant reproductive success in different island ecosystems. Okay. Whoop. Then I don't know why now I cannot move to the next page. Why is that? Oh, we should have tried this. I don't know what the problem is. Let's see.
Anna, let's get back again.
Deja de compartir. Okay.
Yeah. Let's try again.
Okay. No. Yes. Now can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, just apologies for this. Well, I don't think I need to convince this audience that islands are wonderful natural laboratories in ecology and evolutionary biology. Important concepts, ecological and evolutionary concepts, have first become evident on islands. It's just as examples, the allopathic speciation processes or the pervasive species-area relationships. And islands are also ideal systems for understanding the complexity, especially because of islands have well-defined borders and because of their simplified biota. And actually, the first to point this out was Alfred Russel Wallace, who said that it's not too much to say that when we have mastered the difficulties presented by the peculiarities of island life, we shall find it comparatively easy to deal with the more complex and less clearly defined problems on continents. So it's widely accepted that islands do provide unusual research opportunities with implications that stretch far beyond such ecosystems. As you know, also islands have a very rich biota. They hold more than 20% of all terrestrial plant and vertebrate species in the less than 5% of the emerged land that islands represent. Islands also hold 10 of the 35 recognized world biodiversity hotspots. And islands have about 10 times more endemic species than on continents. However, island biodiversity, expressed not only by the species, but by the myriad of interactions evolved among them, is largely unknown, mostly unknown. And this is mostly due to the remoteness and difficult accessibility, and perhaps also because we are not so many island ecologists working on these aspects. And you probably know this article that was published about 2 months ago, early this year. I recommend it to you. It's a very nice review paper that provides evidence of the extinctions worldwide. And well, they just show that most islands, most extinctions are occurring on islands. They just put this example that we all know. Also, 2,000 bird species went extinct in the Pacific Islands after human colonized these islands, and this represents about 1/6 of the current worldwide bird fauna. They also provide examples, for instance, in Rapa, in the Austral Islands, in French Polynesia, in which in an area of only 40 square kilometers with many endemic land snails, plants, and insects, they are now completely, they are gone, they are distinct, especially because of this habitat destruction and well, mainly also the problem of invasive species that, as you know, is one of the main problems for island biodiversity. Okay, now moving to this island species interactions. What traits these interactions have? Well, islands are low in species diversity, as you know, and also in biotic interaction complexity. This is illustrated very well, for instance, with the plant-pollinator interactions. So plants are usually pollinated by a very small fraction compared to the mainland of pollinators, and also the visitation rate is much lower than on the mainlands. Some island species, as you also know, can reach high abundances, and this is due to the famous density or well-known density compensation phenomenon, a low interspecific competition and a reduced predation and parasitism is compensated by these high densities in some species. And these species behave as what is called super generalists. So they interact with many other species in the community, in the interaction network, usually acting as hubs. And as hubs, you know, are the nodes of the networks that are very important. Islands also show often opportunistic species interactions that we rarely find in the mainland. So species that act as insectivores, for instance, in the mainland, they include other resources like floral resources on islands. So the scarcity of food items together with the high intraspecific competition lead to this food niche expansion that in turn lead to what is called an interaction release. That is nothing else than an extension of the ecological release, which is a term introduced by Crowell 60 years ago, meaning this expansion in density, distribution, or behavior of a species. So this interaction release means that the species interacts with many more other species. And this phenomena is usually observed in these density compensating island vertebrates. And we have vertebrate pollination. I'm going to talk a bit about this. We have seen many of these examples, but we still don't know how effective they are as pollinators. So we know that lizards, geckos, different types of birds visit the flowers. They consume nectar and pollen, but we know very little still on what is the effect on the reproductive success of the plants. So with this question in mind also, and knowing and wanting to know how important is vertebrate pollination, we did this study in the Galapagos, in which, well, the first goal was to look at the impact of invasive species on the mutualistic networks, but we examine here. So here we will focus just on the networks, including vertebrates. So we found that most birds in the Galapagos transport pollen of at least 106 species from all habitats and the two main seasons. From all life forms, we found some species and individuals being more than 20,000 pollen grains. And we already published this 6 years or 7 years ago, showing that yes, this interaction release. This is the network that we found, including the 12 main islands that we sampled. Above we have these red rectangles, these are the bird species, and below the plant species, in green the native ones, and in violet the alien species. The larger rectangles are those species that interact with more plants, right? So you can see here that at least these 5 species, and that's 3 finches, the Galapagos flycatcher, and the yellow warbler, are those visiting the flowers of most species. And from the plant's viewpoint, you see that two of the most generalized species, or being visited by more bird species, are actually two alien species, which are these Impatiens balsamina and Psidium guajava. And what we found is that these species are integrated in the pollination network by linking to the most generalized bird species. When looking at species level network metrics, we found no differences between alien species and native species. I'm not going to enter on these metrics, but just want to tell you that we found that aliens are equally visited or similarly visited by birds than natives. And well, a typical example is this Lantana camara, very invasive everywhere. And in Galapagos, we have this Lantana, endemic Lantana peduncularis, so birds visit equally both lantanas. And we also wanted to know if the different bird functional groups were also visiting the flowers equally or similarly, and we found that, yeah, there were no significant differences, although these herbivores tended to visit more species, the differences were not significant. And these functional groups, of course, we have classified them by looking first at this handbook of birds of the world. Okay, one important network metric is modularity. The modules are groups of species that interact more between them or among them than with other nodes in the network. So what we found here was just one whole module. So modularity was not significant, and this means that this reflects this strong interaction release I was telling you about, and which is interpreted as this massive response of the bird community towards these flowers that are not much exploited because insects are not very abundant in the Galapagos. These red lines that you see go to these alien introduced plants. So it's a good fraction of these species, of these interactions involve alien plants. So birds may enhance plant invasions on this increasingly human altered archipelago. And just for you to see, to compare this bird network with the insect network that we had published previously, you can see in the case of insects, there are different modules, but in this bird, it's just one. We in Galapagos also build the seed dispersal network. In this case, like here, I show you just the data from two most intensively studied islands. In this case, we have one alien bird. There's only one alien bird in the Galapagos, fortunately, but this acts as a disperser. And actually, it also disperses seeds of alien species. These are the three here in red, the lantana, the blackberry, and Psidium guajava. It disperses these seeds. And well, although most are birds, we also have in this network the lava lizards, endemic lava lizards in the genus Microlophus, and the giant tortoises. This is another visualization of the degree of integration of these alien species in red in the Galapagos network. And you can see it's much invaded, but it still is little invaded if we compare it with the seed dispersal network from Azores that Ruben Heleno studied in his PhD thesis. And in the case of this seed dispersal network, we did find modules. So these species in nodes that you see in different color, they interact more strongly with among them than with the rest. And these modules showed both a phylogenetic and a geographical component. And such modular structure is known to show strong resistance against extinction cascades. It's also important to study, when looking at modularity, the role of the species. So we distinguish like the peripherals, which would be the least important species, the connectors, or species that connect the different models. So they are important in like making the network more or less cohesive, the module hubs and the network hubs. So you see in asterisk, I mark here the alien species, and they are all peripherals, or most of them, but except in some cases like this blackberry I was telling you about, which is, has been found to act as a connector. And this is commonly found in other species, in other communities where invasive species play an important role and may change the network structure of the native community. Okay, we had, as I told you, we have found that birds visit, or vertebrates visit the flowers, but we don't know how good they are as how effective they are as pollinators. For this more intensive work, you need to do experiments, exclusion experiments. So we did this more recently with 4 species, 3 typically entomophilous, so visited mostly by insects, and 1 typically ornithophilous, which is the endemic Opuntia echios. We calculated both the quantitative component of pollination, which involves like the visitation rate and the number of flowers contacted in each visit, and also the qualitative component of pollination. In this quantitative component, we found that birds were not quantitatively important compared to insects, except for Opuntia. I also am not going to enter on these details, but just remember this, that quantitatively they are not as important, but qualitatively we found that all components of fitness that we consider, which were fruit set, seed set, fruit length, and seedling emergence, all improved when both birds and insects visited the flowers, so in the control treatment. Okay, so the conclusion was that opportunistic birds can act as effective pollinators. And here you see this Magnirostris, Geospiza magnirostris, full of pollen. The conclusion, or one of the conclusions of this study, was that the Galapagos pollination systems are more generalized than previously thought. And despite entomophilous species dominate the Galapagos flora, we argue that birds might play an important role in maintaining the reproductive success and diversity of plant communities. The next question was, okay, do these opportunistic birds show preferences for floral traits? We know from the syndrome framework, the floral syndrome framework, that ornithophilous species have a set of traits like red-orange corollas, no scents, long tubular perianth, abundant and diluted nectar, that differ from those that are typically entomophilous. However, these syndromes are thought for species that are nectarivorous, so specialized species. Is not the case of these opportunistic birds in Galapagos. So our question was here whether these opportunistic birds might exert some selective pressure on floral traits that we could distinguish that are different from floral traits that are mostly visited, or florals visited by insects, only by insects. So from an entire community involving 26 plants, we studied these 14 morphological traits. We also looked at these nectar traits, nectar volume and sugar concentration with measurements with a refractometer in the field. And also then we related these traits with our visitation frequency data. For this, our unit was the interaction frequencies, or the number of censuses with legitimate visits, or the number of bird samples with pollen with respect to the total number of censuses. So this involved lots of many hours, as you can see. And then we analyzed this by this non-metric multi-dimensional scaling analysis to detect if there were different groups involving these birds or insects separately. And we did find that these two different groups, some plants that had bowl and tubular shaped flowers with narrower corollas and nectary level and lower nectar volume that were mostly visited by insects, which is this blue this blue group, I would say. And the other green would be bell-shaped flowers, white flowers with wider corollas and nectary level and higher nectar volume, mostly visited by birds. These bird flowers would include both endemic and native species, while those visited mostly by insects are mostly native species. So the conclusion from this analysis was that bird-visited flowers display mixed traits, not fitting the classical ornithophilus syndrome, that plasticity of floral traits might help plants to adjust their reproductive strategy in response to these islands that are poor in pollinators, opening a window of opportunity for non-specialized visitor. So this plasticity might eventually lead to a floral diversification. Of course, this is a hypothesis that will need to be tested in future studies. And the same, we need molecular phylogenetic studies to assess whether these species that are mainly pollinated by birds evolved in situ after colonizing Galapagos, and they might have become more specialized than the mainland relatives. Okay, now I will move to another subject that we have been investigating also in the last year, that is the double mutualism phenomenon. This term was coined by Dennis Hansen and Christine Müller more than a decade ago to refer to this dual dependency between that occurs when two interacting species benefit each other into different functions, like for instance pollination and seed dispersal. So in these cases, in these examples I show you here, you see the same animal species pollinating and dispersing the same plant species. These cases are difficult to detect, as most studies focus just on one ecological function, right? So most information is scattered across primary and grade literature. These double mutualisms involve a double positive feedback loop. So by pollinating the plant, the animal has more fruits later in the season to feed upon. And in turn, by dispersing the seeds, the animal contributes to increased plant recruitment, producing more flowers, more fruits, and so on. In theory, such positive interactions are known to be unstable, and this reduces community resilience and increases its vulnerability to disturbances. So double mutualism seems to represent a double benefit at the first glance for the species, but might imply also a double risk for community persistence if they are disturbed. So in the first chapter of the thesis of our PhD student that I share with Christopher Kaiser-Bunbury, that I'm sure you know, Francisco Fuste, he did this meta-analysis and compiled from this gray and well-published gray literature and published results more than 300 records of double mutualism interactions involving more than 200 plants and nearly 100 animal species. Okay. I'm listening some noise. And well, all these records are both from mainland areas and from island areas. And well, we found that more than 65% of records were from tropical areas. Most records were from the neotropics and also from Australasia. whereas from the Palearctic and the Nearctic, there were very, very few cases. And when we compared statistically the island cases with the mainland cases, we found that double mutualism were more frequently reported on islands than on the mainland. This double mutualism involved 75 families, the Fabaceae and the Cactaceae being the most common. And well, 21% of the plant species were involved in more than one case of double mutualistic interactions. The large majority of plant species were woody. Also, they had actinomorphic flowers. And well, the large majority were also fleshy fruited species, but yeah, also nearly 30% had dry fruits. But as you know, birds, well, invertebrates in general, disperse also dry fruits, not only fleshy fruits. From the animal point of view, animal double mutualists, the large majority were non-specialized nectarivores, except for one species of ant. The rest were all vertebrates, most of them being birds in the order Passeriformes, although the parrots and the Psittaciformes were also important. In the mammals, most of them were bats and primates. Within the primates, there are a number of lemurs that pollinate and disperse the same plant species. And among the reptilia, also, there were several families, the Iguanidae being the most important. So overall, of all these animal double mutualists, 62% were birds, nearly 22% were mammals, and 16% were reptiles. And we found that 50% of the species involved were involved in more than one double mutualism case. A number of double mutualism also were more frequently reported from islands when involving birds or lizards. But in the case of mammals, there were no significant differences. And we also looked at the conservation of these species, and we found that nearly 30% are threatened according to the UCN criteria. And of these, 68% are island species. When I say threatened, this means critically endangered or nearly threatened. And as you can see for this, for the reptilia, there is this gray rectangle, means that data deficient. So it has not been evaluated yet. So it could be much higher. And we found that generalist and nectar specialist species are similarly threatened, about 26%. And at least one case is there's at least one case it has been an extinction of a species. So this Hawaiian crow used to pollinate and disperse these species in the Pandanaceae, but is now extinct in the wild. So the disruption of these interactions may have largely and no consequences for community functioning, because these double mutualists form part, as we found in a recent study, form part of the core of mutualistic interactions in the community. So if this core is disrupted, the consequences for the entire network can be very important. And here I just put this example, which I think is very neat, of a very tight animal double mutualism. Is the case of in Reunion of a gecko, the Phelsuma cepediana, who pollinates and disperses the seeds of this Rusea simplex. But after this, the invasion of this white-footed ant, Temnomyrmex albipes, the gecko population is going down, and in turn, the plant population is going down, is threatened. So identifying double mutualism may be a useful strategy to assess the vulnerability of an ecosystem overall, and also may be useful to establish conservation priorities. Okay, here in the Mediterranean region, we have also found these double mutualistic interactions. And in the thesis of this Francisco Fuste, we have been studying the case of Ephedra fragilis, which is a relict gymnosperm. It's pollinated and dispersed by the endemic lizard we have here, Podarcis lilfordi, in the family Lacertidae. And what Francisco found is that the lizards were more frequently visitors than insects in the flowers, for the flowers. And within the lizards, there was intraspecific differences. So males visited more frequently than females and juveniles. Regarding fruit consumption, also males tended to be more important than males and mostly than juveniles. And still we have been studying another case of double mutualistic interaction in the Balearic Islands, also with another relict species, that's Neorum trichocon. And in this case, also lizards visit more flowers and selected more hermaphrodite flowers. This is an andromonoecious species, so the same individual produces hermaphrodite flowers and male flowers. Here we show just the data on hermaphrodite flowers, which are the ones that are going to become fruits. So lizards are again more important than insects. And again, there is intraspecific differences. In this case, females and juveniles are more frequent visitors than males. So it's the opposite than in Ephedra. But when we look at the fruit phase, we found, well, first that fruit and seed set increase also when lizards visit the flowers. And in this case, males visit fruiting plants more often than females and juveniles. So this intraspecific variation in the mutualistic functions still has been little documented in general, but we think could be more widespread than previously thought. And due to the different behavior that usually, especially in reptiles, males and females have, this might have also important consequences for plant recruitment. So it's something that needs to be examined in further detail. Okay, and now I'm entering a bit the threats to such mutualistic interactions and what we have been we have been working on this, and we have contributed with also some studies to show what are the consequences of these disruptions. The number of papers reporting, documenting these disruptions is increasingly from the mainland, but also especially from islands. And we have been, for instance, studying in the Canary Islands how the alien rats and the alien honeybees affect some endemic species. In this case is the case of the Canarina canarensis. Is an endemic species, a very nice species in the Campanulaceae family. It was already previously known that only birds act as effective pollinators. This was studied in the laurel forest. We did this study in the Thermophilus forest. We found that the alien Apis mellifera, the honeybee, decreases plant fitness by half. It depletes the nectar, so the birds do not have this food, and then this nectar, they do not pollinate it. And the number of seeds produced are reduced by half. And also rats consume 10% of the flowers and reduce fruit set also by 1/3, which is also quite a lot. Another endemic species we have been studying, this was in the thesis of Julia Jaca, is on this nice endemic Echium simplex. Echium, as you know, or some of you know, is a genus that has radiated in the Canary Islands. And Echium are also pollinated by vertebrates besides insects. In this case, as you can see, these nice pictures by Benearo Rodriguez, birds and lizards pollinate these flowers. But there are many goats. This is in Tenerife. This is an endemic species in Tenerife Island. There are many goats, as I said, which is an invasive species which love to eat these inflorescence. And Julia studied this herbivory, while classifying the levels of herbivory, but I'm going just over all this. She found that in 2015, nearly half of the inflorescence or the plants were damaged, and the year later, it was almost 100% that the plants were damaged, and 30% of the inflorescence were totally consumed. Then, of course, this plant does not have any vegetative growth. It depends on the seeds. So it's likely that with this intensive herbivory, the plant, which is already restricted to a few points in Tenerife, may lead to the extinction, may become extinct, I mean. And still another study we have been doing in the last years is in the Seychelles, where this Francisco Fuster also did a stay. It's another chapter of his thesis. He looked at the impact of these invasive ants, I think this was the yellow crazy ant, on the pollination of 4 species. One was, well, I forgot now the names. It says, well, here I said it's the Specia, Syzygium, and then Polycias. Okay, and in the case of Polycias and Syzygium, he found again that the pollination or the visitation rate by these skinks was reduced when the ants were present. We are now doing conducting another study in Ibiza. It's an island here in the Balearic Islands. You may have heard about it because it's famous, because many famous actors live there. This island is very disturbed, and recently this snake from the Iberian Peninsula, Hemorrhois hippocrepis, which is the horseshoe snake, was introduced with ornamental olive trees. And this snake is leading to the extinction of this endemic Podarcis pituosensis. So in this study that is funded by the National Geographic Society and is coordinated by Oriol Lapiedra, who studied in the Bahamas, now in Barcelona, at the University Autónoma de Barcelona, we are studying different aspects. And here in my group, we are interested in knowing what's going to happen to these plants that depend for their pollination or seed dispersal on this lizard. So results in the next talks or next symposia. And also I am collaborating with the team of Adam Cronin from the Tokyo Metropolitan University in another project that is also funded by the National Geographic Society. And here we are performing studies to build the pollination networks on Ogasawara archipelago. Assessing the impact of 2 important invasive species, one being Anolis carolinensis, which preys upon insects, including, of course, pollinators, and the Apis mellifera, which is also competing with the native insects, the native bees, especially. These are very preliminary results. Well, Marta is now a postdoc in my lab. She's working on this data she got last year. She's now going back in 2 months from now. And what you can see here is that the 2 most inhabited islands, which are Chichijima and Hagajima, like the 2 most important pollinators are just one, like the Apis mellifera, which is the one that performs most visits, and the Xylocopa ogasawaraensis. While in the others that are the less disturbed, Anijima and Nototojima, the diversity of pollinators is much higher. This is just an illustration of how the pollination networks look like. And you can see this in Chichijima and Hakajima, how poor the pollinator community is. So that means that it is more vulnerable to any type of disturbance that can come in the future. So the take-home messages from this talk would be that island biodiversity is still much unknown, especially regarding species interactions. Many species and interactions are threatened, mostly by invasive species, and will probably disappear before being discovered. This interaction release at the community level is probably more common on islands than previously thought, but it just has to be studied in other archipelagos. And we'll see how common this pattern is. Opportunistic vertebrates, we've shown that they can act as effective pollinators, similarly as the typical nectarivorous species vertebrates, and can also act as legitimacy dispersers. This double mutualism phenomenon is especially prevalent on islands. We've seen that a large fraction of these animal double mutualists are threatened or nearly threatened, and we have no clue on what the consequences for the community will be when they disappear. And also, I think I have convinced you that we need to look at the intraspecific differences in these plant-animal interactions. And also, yeah, we need to look at the consequences of such intraspecific variation, because also we don't know much about these consequences. And I will end up thanking my wonderful team of collaborators. I feel very fortunate to work with Jens Olesen, Ruben, Manuel Nogales, Pablo Vargas, Chris Kaiser, currently in Exeter, and who has lots of experience in the Seychelles, Sandra Hervillas, and well, these two postdocs, also Francisco and Julia, did a very good job with this project on the role of vertebrates. And thank you for your attention.